Good morning, everyone. My name is Marc Mamigonian. I want to welcome you all, conference participants and attendees alike, on behalf of the sponsors of this conference, that is, the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark, the Kalustian Mugar Chair at Clark, the Armenian Genocide Program at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and Worcester State University, numerous entities thereof. And on behalf of the conference organizing committee, that is, Taner Akcan, Sara Cushman, Deborah Dwork, Kachi Goradyan, Henry Terrio, and myself. Everyone has worked hard to bring this conference into being, but a special thanks must go to Sara Cushman, who has at all times, with good humor, intelligence, and efficiency, kept everything moving forward. Thank you, Sara. I think that among the organizers, and I hope among everyone who will participate and attend the conference last night and today, that there's a sense that this is the right time for such a gathering and such a discussion. We felt that it was the right time to bring together scholars from various and diverse fields who are concerned with denial in its many forms, and we will hear about many of them today. We think we can learn from each other. That is the very simple, basic message and purpose of this conference. And that is the gist of my very brief welcoming remarks, because we are slightly behind schedule and we want to try to be on schedule. Without further ado, let's begin the first session, Modern Strategies and Rhetoric of Denial, and I will hand things over to our moderator, Ann Matossian.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to session 1 of Manufacturing Denial. It's a pleasure to be back at Clark University. And on behalf of this panel, may I thank the conference committee for their very kind invitation. Last night we heard from a political scientist about why people refuse to accept unwelcome facts. This morning we'll be discussing modern strategies and rhetoric of denial. In other words, denial as a practice of purposeful, targeted communications. First, Marc Mamigonian, the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, will analyze Armenian genocide denial as a manufactured controversy in American scholarship. As we heard last night, an earlier version of this paper actually inspired this entire conference, so please pay close attention to it. Second, Sara Brown, a Stern Family Fellow at the Strassler Center here at Clark, will draw on her field research to discuss genocide denial in Rwanda, a very original approach. And lastly, Shawn Olson, our third speaker, will take us farther afield and explore denialism in climate science, politics, and policy. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present, and I will offer some concluding thoughts. So if you would, please hold your questions for our discussion at the end. Marc, would you like to begin?
I would, thank you.
All right.
2 decades ago, thank you. 2 decades ago, historian Ronald Sunni wrote that, quote, every hypothesis, interpretation, even fact or event in the contested field of Armeno-Turkish relations has been rendered controversial by paid propagandists and public relations firms hired by the Turkish government, assisted by pseudo-scholars and the unsuspecting. The field of inquiry has thus been structured by denial and prevarication that has forced those who would try to establish a more credible record and provide explanation to take up a combative stance. Sunni was not asserting that there was or is a legitimate controversy about the facts of the Armenian genocide. His point was that, legitimate or not, the field of inquiry has been structured by the efforts to create a controversy through denial and prevarication. The manufacturing of controversy continues today, and denial has made inroads within academia, and the repercussions extend well beyond academia. For example, in December 2013, the European Court of Human Rights found that a conviction of Turkish political figure Dolu Perinçek under Switzerland's anti-racism laws for denying the Armenian genocide was a violation of his freedom of expression. The court said that Perinçek had never questioned the massacres and deportations perpetrated during the years in question, only the legal characterization of those events as genocide. The court thus appeared to find a subtle legal argument in Perenchek's statement that the Armenian genocide was, quote, an international lie. Moreover, the court doubted that there could be a general consensus as to events such as those at issue here, given that historical research was by definition open to discussion and a matter of debate. As this decision stands for now, it is a crowning achievement in the ongoing effort to attach permanently the words controversial or debatable to the phrase Armenian genocide, and to construct a reality in which there can never be a consensus and there will always be a debate over even basic facts and interpretations. These rhetorical strategies are well traveled. In 1969, a tobacco company executive wrote that, as Kachik quoted last night, that doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. In 1972, the vice president of the industry-run Tobacco Institute described the strategy of creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. In a 2002 memo, Republican strategist Frank Luntz advised that the scientific debate on global warming is closing, but not yet closed. There is still a window of opportunity to challenge the science. You need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. Similarly, in 2011, Taner Akçam related that he had been informed that a US-based academic had counseled the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs that instead of confronting the Armenian issue directly, the thing you need to do is to dig a ditch in front of all the genocide claims. You need to create doubt by writing scholarly works which will awaken that doubt. The ditch diggers have been busy. A Potemkin village of denialist scholarship has been built, not meant to convey the impression of a robust scholarly debate and to lay claim to academic credibility while always seeking to forestall any conclusions being drawn or any consequences arising from such conclusions. In many instances, this form of denial coexists comfortably alongside and indeed makes use of more traditional modes such as blaming Armenians for their own destruction and rationalizing support for Turkey's conduct on the basis of political expediency. The creation of academic denial that purports to be engaging in honest inquiry by exploring both sides of a dispute has had the same effect in both the natural and social sciences. The debate itself becomes a key structural component of any discussion of the subject. Armenian genocide denial emerged in American universities during the Cold War. The rise of area studies included the development of Turkish studies, among whose ranks were a group of academics bent on, in the words of Richard Hovhannissian, dissipating the heavy cloud that blotted the reputation of the Turkish nation. This meant downplaying, rationalizing, or denying the Armenian genocide. There are but a few examples. By the late 1970s, early 1980s, with both activism and scholarship on the Armenian genocide expanding, new methods of denial were needed. Some of these new methods were old hat for Turkey's new PR advisors, including Hill and Knowlton. As the architect of Big Tobacco's denial strategy, this firm possessed considerable experience in the kind of narrative reframing Turkey sought and which it would pursue with increasing vigor following the appointment of Shukru Elikdag as ambassador to the US in 1979. In the long version of my paper, I discussed the creation of the Turkish government-funded Institute of Turkish Studies in the early 1980s and some of its activities. Among these was the crafting of a 1985 advertisement in the New York Times and Washington Post that urged Congress not to pass a resolution recognizing the genocide as such. The ad gave the names of 69 scholars sent to question the appropriateness of the word genocide, emphasized the existence of a historical debate, and declared that, quote, much more remains to be discovered before historians will be able to sort out precisely the responsibility between warring and innocent. I see this project as analogous to, if not indeed inspired by, the famous 1954 Big Tobacco frank statement to cigarette smokers devised by Hill and Knowlton to allay growing concerns over the impacts of smoking on health. The 69 scholars' statement was used for years in order to demonstrate the existence of a scholarly debate. But by the year 2000, Elikdag would complain that unfortunately this document cannot be used effectively now, and that ITS had lost its function and its effectiveness. Since that time, the Turkish state and those who support it have ratcheted up their efforts, refining and expanding the methods of the 1980s, as Jennifer Dixon has documented in her work. In 2009, when the creation of the Turkish Studies Project at the University of Utah was announced, it was appropriate that Shukru Elikdag was on its advisory board, since the effort could be seen as the fulfillment of his vision. The Utah Project, directed by Hakan Yavuz and generously funded by the Turkish Coalition of America, has been singularly productive, issuing books and organizing conferences on various Ottoman topics, with special care taken to promote the existence of a debate among scholars over the events of 1915. Utah had established itself as a denialist beachhead in 2005 with the publication of Günter Louis' The Armenian Massacres in Ottoman Turkey, a Disputed Genocide. The book's publication at Utah was arranged by Yavuz after its rejection by several other academic presses. Louis, a retired professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, was well established as what my co-panelist Shawn Olson might call a wise contrarian, if I'm understanding the concept correctly, and if I'm not, I'm very embarrassed to be using the term. Based on his revisionist work, American Vietnam, as well as writings on the Roma and the Native Americans that concluded that these groups were not victims of genocide. He presents himself as a neutral arbiter of this dispute, who objectively weighs the merits of both sides. In the end, he finds no authentic documentary evidence exists to prove the culpability of the central government of Turkey for the massacre of 1915 and 16. And he is not overly optimistic that we will ever gain definitive knowledge of the chain of events leading up to the Armenian tragedy. This history will remain permanently in the realm of debate. Louis stops just short of saying that Armenians deserved the harsh treatment they received. Although the Turks eventually came to consider the Armenians a fifth column, he writes, and decided to take decisive measures to put an end to these treasonable actions, he allows that none of this can serve to justify what the Turks did to the Armenians. But this caveat comes with the addendum: Armenians can hardly claim that they suffered for no reason at all. And while the Armenians were victims, not all of them were innocent victims. There's very little in Louis' book that could be called new. Its significance lay in its bearing the stamp of an American university press, thus granting it a certain level of credibility and prestige. The Contra-Genocide thesis had a new text that could and would be cited ad infinitum as the other side of the debate, and the value of the book was duly recognized in Turkish circles. Articles providing a foretaste of Louis' book appeared in fall 2005, just before a lawsuit was filed here in Massachusetts by the Assembly of Turkish American Associations, claiming censorship because the Department of Education decided to exclude genocide-denying resources from its genocide curriculum guide. The basis of the lawsuit, in the words of then ATAA President Günay Evinç, was, quote, protecting public school access to scholarly sources pertaining to a legitimate historical controversy for educational purposes. Louis' work was duly invoked during the lawsuit, but the failure of the Massachusetts case, among other things, pointed out the need for more convincing-looking materials promoting the legitimate historical controversy. The Turkish Coalition of America, formed in 2007 with $30 million from a Turkish-American businessman, has made the legitimate historical controversy project a major focus, funding publications and the Utah Turkish Studies Project, and energetically declaring the existence of a scholarly debate. A section of its website declares, quote, the Ottoman-Armenian tragedy is a genuine historic controversy. Many reputable scholars challenge the conventional one-sided anti-Turkish narrative and or refrain from alleging the crime of genocide. Excerpts from the writings of some 34 scholars meant to illustrate this point are provided. The TCA deployed its list of legitimate scholarly resources in its unsuccessful 2010 lawsuit against the University of Minnesota and its Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. The suit alleged defamation and violation of free speech and due process because the center had listed TCA among other unreliable sources on genocide. A key aspect of TCA's argument was, in effect, how can we be an unreliable resource when we have a list of credible scholars who support our position? Although the Massachusetts and Minnesota lawsuits failed, they nonetheless contributed to the idea that the subject of the Armenian genocide is inherently controversial, if not radioactive, thus helping to root the discussion in the controversy itself. One of TCA's funded publications is Armenian History and the Question of Genocide by Michael Gunter of Tennessee Technical University, and issued by the academic publisher Paul Grave Macmillan. The book shows significant continuities with Louis' work as well as official Turkish rhetoric. Gunter himself states that his book presents the Turkish position regarding the Armenian claims of genocide in the continuing debate over this issue, while also claiming that the book is, quote, not a Turkish apology. Like Louis, Gunter would have it that there have been two sides to the question. This means acknowledging that Armenians suffered a great disaster, but, quote, the Armenian claim that they were victims of a premeditated and unprovoked genocide does not ring true, unquote. In fact, the Armenians were something less than wholly innocent victims, a point which he takes care to make in those or similar words 9 times in the book. Each writer shifts at least partial blame onto the victims themselves, in the process creating a new criterion for the victims of genocide, the need to be wholly innocent. Such rhetoric is indeed indistinguishable from the official Turkish position. For example, ex-Turkish Ambassador Gündüz Aktan declared in congressional testimony in the year 2000 that, quote, the victims of genocide must be totally innocent, unquote, a litmus test that Armenians must appear to fail. In an article published in a peer-reviewed journal guest edited by Hakan Yavuz on the scholarship on Turkish and Armenian controversy over the nature of the events of 1915, Utah graduate student Tal Buenos justifies the extermination of Armenians in Hobbesian terms. Quote, the Ottoman Empire, caught in a situation of conflict that threatened its continued existence as such, followed Hobbes' law of nature and acted to remove this threat in an effort to increase its own chances of survival. Even if the fashion in which it acted to remove this threat is disagreeable and condemnable, Hobbesian logic permits any type of action when sincerely battling for survival. He formulates a new concept, which he calls genovive. Under this framework, any action taken by a nation conceived of as being necessary for its preservation would exempt it from the crime of genocide, which is not to say that he allows for any possibility that there was a genocide. Quote, the attempts to label the catastrophe of World War I as genocide should abate. If it truly were genocide, the Turks would have admitted to it a long time ago, as did the German nation following World War II, QED. In an article jointly authored by Yavuz and Buenos, the same ideas are expressed more succinctly. Quote, it is not only the intent of the assailants that is of significance in the scholarly endeavor to better understand the definition of genocide, but also that of the victims. It should be asked, were the victims honorable citizens, or did they become victims after clear efforts to rebel and challenge a sovereign? Whether the Ottoman Armenians were honorable citizens or not, it seems, is also a controversial point. Part of the Orwellian project of denial, not merely denial of the Armenian genocide, but denial in general, is to reverse the charges, so to speak. That is, the victims were the aggressors, those who stand against denial and distortion of facts are enemies of truth and are purveyors of hate and violence. For instance, a 1969 tobacco campaign called, remarkably, Project Truth, had among its objectives to expose the, quote, criminal libel against the cigarette and to prove that the cigarette has been brought to trial by lynch law. Sociologist and cigarette advocate Peter L. Berger even declared in 1977 that anti-smoking is the new anti-Semitism. Consequently, it is not surprising to find that the past president of the Assembly of Turkish American Associations has written that, quote, Turks are the new Jews, genocide crowds are the new KKK. Facts, figures no longer matter to these lynch mobs. Likewise, the Turkish American Legal Defense Fund, in an amicus brief in the Massachusetts lawsuit, compared Armenians to white supremacists in the Jim Crow South. Academics tend not to take such an inflammatory tone, but the basic rhetoric is similar. Yavuz observes, frequently those who question the application of the term genocide to the events of 1915 are labeled, I'm one behind, are labeled as deniers, and they are silenced or delegitimized as a result of this weighty stigma, rendering the framework of genocide a conversation stopper. The concept of genocide does not help to build bridges. Thus, not only are Armenians blamed for causing their own destruction in Ottoman Turkey, they and others who talk and write about the genocide are faulted for not building bridges by acquiescing to its denial. Unlike Holocaust denial, denial of the Armenian genocide has the support of a powerful government and wealthy and well-connected activists in the U.S., as well as advocates in American academia, as we see. Since deniers seek to present the subject as a debate between the Turkish side and the Armenian side, credible scholars are needed who serve as the other side. An increasingly valuable commodity are scholars who, perhaps seeking to confront deniers head-on, perhaps for other reasons, have supplied deniers with what they crave most, interlocutors, legitimacy, and a debate. Academic freedom grants scholars great leeway, and many scholars will sigh that countenancing denial is a necessary price to pay for this freedom. It may be so. Academic integrity, however, is also a cherished ideal, though, or ought to be. A challenge that lies before scholars is the need to uphold academic integrity by producing rigorous works that take the phenomenon of denial seriously without granting the deniers the status of scholars engaged in a legitimate debate. Thank you.
Sara, you're on. Thank you. On October 3rd, BBC Two aired a documentary titled Rwanda's Untold Story. The one-hour documentary claimed to, quote, reveal evidence that challenges the accepted story of one of the most horrifying events of the 20th century, end quote. But in truth, it was a poorly researched and produced attempt to deny the genocide that occurred in Rwanda. The airing of the piece resulted in protests, multiple petitions signed by thousands, and a widely publicized letter that criticized the documentary and was signed by 38 experts on the Rwandan genocide, including in the audience we have with us Tim Gallimore. Thank you. It was also signed by Senator Romeo Dallaire, the head of the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during the genocide, and a host of prominent politicians, scholars, and activists. While the BBC strongly refuted the suggestion that any part of the program constitutes a denial of the genocide against the Tutsi, the documentary clearly attempted to modify, revise, or in some instances, reject the history of the genocide. The documentary's content does, in fact, constitute genocide denial, albeit in an indirect form and under the guise of journalistic inquiry. Unfortunately, these indirect efforts are much more difficult to identify and expose versus overt attempts to reject or rewrite historical record. Genocide denial is not a new phenomenon that is exclusive to Rwanda. Denial is a widely recognized stage of genocide, and it often occurs in concurrence with the outbreak of genocide. And it is elemental to its perpetration. In Rwanda, genocide denial is a complex, multifaceted issue spanning 20 years of modern globalized history. From the event that sparked the genocide, to the total number of dead, to the necessity of stipulating who was a victim of genocide versus politically motivated mass murder, all items covered by the aforementioned documentary, the 1994 genocide is subject to debate that often veers towards scurrilous speculation. Now, despite efforts to criminalize genocide denial in Rwanda, attacking the historical accuracy of the genocide in the name of liberal intellectualism has been used by denialists not only to criticize post-genocide legal proceedings, challenge genocide survivor groups, and discredit the government in Rwanda, it is also used to challenge the narrative of genocide altogether. Often, the loudest proponents of denial are those who participated in the genocide themselves, or those who are associated with the extremists that perpetrated the genocide. For example, one of the most famous suspected perpetrators of the genocide is Agathe Habyarimana, the wife of the president who was assassinated in 1994, the event which is thought to have sparked the genocide. Wanted for genocide crimes in Rwanda, Agathe gave an interview in 2007 with The Guardian and denied the genocide outright, claiming, "It's all lies, I deny the law." For Habyarimana, a once powerful leader in Rwandan society who has twice had her asylum application rejected by the French government, to admit that the genocide took place under her careful watch would be a symbolic acknowledgement not just of the genocide, but also of her role in it. As is the case in other instances of genocide, the strategies employed by denialists are varied and often difficult to combat and counteract. It is an unfortunate reality that Rwanda is in company with others when it comes to the invalidation of suffering and genocide denial. However, one facet that is thus far unique to the 1994 genocide is the Gacaca courts, an impressive and innovative judicial mechanism created to try genocide perpetrators in Rwanda, and its ripple effect on truth-telling and genocide denial. The Gacaca courts, brief backgrounder, were born out of frustration with the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the need to try more than 120,000 suspected perpetrators of genocide who were awaiting trial in prisons throughout the country. Gacaca means to sit on the grass, and it is familiar to Rwandans. It was even being utilized on an ad hoc basis following the genocide. A traditional community-based conflict resolution mechanism, its adapted form then borrowed from legal norms that are considered Western, as well as the truth and reconciliation efforts that were taking place in South Africa. Gacaca was implemented nationwide in 2006, trying over 1.9 million cases and 1,003,227 individuals by the time it officially closed nationwide in June of 2012. Given that the first of the 5 objectives of the Gacaca courts was to identify the truth about what happened during the genocide, a sentencing structure was developed with incentives meant to encourage confessions. If a convicted perpetrator offered a full and truthful account of his or her crimes and any accomplices, very details, and apologized in a manner that was deemed sincere by the court, his or her sentence would be reduced, often by half, and his or her prison sentence would be reduced or eliminated entirely, instead serving his or her sentences in open-air public works programs known as TIGists. I'm deliberately including her because the focus of this talk is on 25 women incarcerated for crimes of genocide at TIGists camps who, during interviews with me, revised, modified, or otherwise falsified their testimonies. For many, this may prompt you to ask why women, a query born of gendered perceptions of women that frame them as passive bystanders or victims in instances of genocide. This oversight is a result of a subjectively flawed interpretation of genocide, especially in Rwanda. Now, we talked about Gacaca's statistics before this. Of the 1,003,227 suspects that were tried by Gacaca, 96,653 were women. That's just under 10%. So it is clear that women did a little bit more than just stand by and allow the genocide to unfold. Rather, they acted as catalysts, as participants, and in some instances, as high-level architects of the genocide. So not only do we need to expand our limited, monolithic narrative that essentializes women according to loaded gender norms, we also need to closely examine the accounts offered by these incarcerated women as they threaten the accuracy and truthfulness of Rwanda's historical record. In some instances, their testimonies go so far as to constitute a form of genocide denial. Now, because of time restrictions, I'm going to focus on two recurring trends that I found during my interviews with respect to genocide denial. The first is denial of participation, and the second is the absence of empathy. In every interview, women were asked how they came to be incarcerated, and in nearly every interview, the women would not speak directly about their actions during the genocide. Instead, a woman would use indirect terms and emphasize what she was accused of doing, rather than what she actually did, often denying outright any participation at all. This was the instance when I happened to sit down with a woman named Gloria, whose name has been changed, who denied participating in the genocide altogether. But when I asked her what she was accused of, Gloria was able to provide a suspiciously detailed account of the murder of her auntie, including all of the people who were present, all family members. Before the Gacaca and Yangamugayo, or judges, Gloria confessed to her crimes and begged forgiveness. But when she spoke to me, she explained, I accepted so that I wouldn't serve a longer sentence. And she went further to insist that, honestly speaking, I don't accept that I killed. I was among the people. I went there because I had heard what was going on, and I decided to go there and see. But when they decided to jail me and they told me, if you don't accept that you were with the people who killed, then they will never release you, you will stay here, I decided to accept that, yes, I was with the group that killed. Gloria's confession was disingenuous, born out of self-interest and a desire to reduce her sentence, rather than a sense of accountability, guilt, or even a desire to tell the truth about what happened during the genocide. In an effort to determine if women felt accountable for their crimes and had therefore taken responsibility, which would in some way indicate both an acceptance of the genocide as well as the woman's role in the genocide, I would ask women if they felt regret for their actions. Often, women perpetrators would emphasize regret born of their own suffering, rather than the suffering of genocide victims or survivors, indicating an absence of personal accountability, empathy, and remorse. One woman, Amy, expressed her regret in these terms: I regret it. Because of that participation, it separated me with my family and my kids. I had to leave my kids when they were still young and come here and be alone, so I regret it. These and other self-centered expressions of regret may be genuine, but they represent a disconcerting trend wherein the suffering experienced by those targeted for murder during the genocide appears lost on the very women who facilitated it. Some may argue that this absence of empathy does not constitute an indicator of denial per se, but at the very least it does allude to a mindset that minimizes or ignores the horrors of the genocide. Now, genocide denial's influence on scholarship is of great importance. The fact that these women were willing to misrepresent themselves to me, a researcher, is of great concern to the historical record being crafted outside of Rwanda. I should note here, by the way, that the two women that I mentioned in this talk, both of them, it was determined by myself and my translator, and also through triangulating court documents, that they were not telling me the truth. So it is of great concern to me that they are in some way possibly affecting the historical record by lying to researchers. However, a more pressing issue is the contribution of these women to future generations within Rwanda. Traditionally responsible for raising the family, maintaining the home, and educating their children, Rwandan women are well positioned to transmit their respective ideologies. If a mother denies the genocide or minimizes her role in its perpetration, or refuses to acknowledge the suffering of the people who were targeted for genocide, or experiences bitterness for that which she lost when she was incarcerated, what will be her impact on the next generation? The women perpetrators serving terms for genocide crimes and denying the genocide in Rwanda through their revised testimonies may be exclusive to Rwanda, but genocide denial is not a new phenomenon. While each instance of genocide bears differentiating characteristics, experiences, and suffering, there exists a space for meaningful comparison. Yehuda Bauer notes that when addressing mass violence, analysis is necessary, not to satisfy some abstract intellectual urge, but for very practical reasons. You have to understand what you're dealing with in order to deal with it intelligently. By tracking and comparing instances of genocide denial, including attempts by women perpetrators to modify, revise, or reject the narrative of genocide, we can begin to identify patterns and develop effective strategies and approaches to counteract its influence. It is imperative that all forms of genocide denial be identified as a threat not only to the accuracy and truthfulness of the historical record, but also to long-term stability and peace. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this morning I'll be talking about the modern climate denial movement, but particularly I'll be talking about the structure of the movement itself and some of the most likely strategies in the production of data about climate science. Okay, so I have three objectives this morning. As one of the few scholars here today studying the denial of natural history and natural science, I would like to provide sort of a primer on climate science denial so that we can have a more productive discussion. And I also wanted to look at some of the motivations underlying climate denial, particularly among celebrity contrarians, as I'll talk about later. And then lastly, sort of concluding my presentation in this session, I'd like to pose some points of similarity and difference between climate change denial and other forms of denial, such as denial of genocide, in hopes to spur some discussion. Okay, and before I begin, I want to point to the fact that I'm working off a paper that Max Boykoff and I wrote last year called Why is Contrarians a Keystone Species in Contemporary Climate Science, Politics, and Policy? And we adopt the term contrarian for a specific reason. There's a lot of debate actually among scholars who study denial of climate science about what's the appropriate word to use to denote people who deny climate change. And there's a lot of debate about the word denier, specifically because it perhaps unappropriately sort of links with denial of genocide and the Holocaust. But we adopt the word contrarian, and particularly we talk about wise contrarians, and as Marc suggested, you were absolutely right. That term actually points to two things. One is what we propose as a link to a much larger historical ongoing sort of anti-environmental science denial that started up in the 70s and 80s. But also we are pointing to the fact that deniers tend to position themselves as the wise ones, the enlightened ones, and those who believe in climate science as the delusional ones in need of enlightenment. Okay, so first of all, who are we talking about? Who are the contrarians? It's really easy for us to point to the fossil fuels industry, and there's a lot of well-documented evidence of the link, the financial link between the fossil fuels industry and the climate denial machine. Additionally, obviously conservative media figures like Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, and the Wall Street Journal, and conservative politicians such as James Inhofe and Paul Ryan. But sort of beneath the curtains, there's a very well-structured organization of foundations and think tanks that play a very big role and that have a lot of money. And I also want to sort of point to the rise of citizen scientists, or you could say pseudoscientists, and the authority that they've gained through use of the blogosphere and new media such as Twitter, and even the commentary section of news article sites. The commentary section of articles from sources like the New York Times. And then Sara and Dunlap basically make this assertion that virtually the entire Republican Party also constitutes part of the denial machine. And in a Gallup poll this year, they found that 70% of Republicans believe that the seriousness of global warming is very greatly exaggerated versus 18% of Democrats. Okay, so I want to complicate motivations of denial of climate science and consider some of these underlying reasons that drive contrarian stances and actions. The easiest motivation to point to is the monetary incentive. It's very easy for us to consider why people would be motivated to defend carbon-based industries. And additionally, there's a lot of documentation that shows that fossil fuels industries are directly funding science in the academy to promote articles that produce skepticism about climate change. In 2007, for example, The Guardian reported that the American Enterprise Institute offered scientists $10,000 to publish articles that were critical of the International Panel on Climate Change report. Okay, so some other sources of motivation. We analyzed some interviews from the 2011 Heartland Institute's conference. It was called the International Conference on Climate Change, the ICCC versus the IPCC. And there were some prominent climate contrarians present at that conference. And what we discovered was there was a real perception among contrarians, those that were scientists, of being excluded from the academy because of their stances on climate change. We also discovered that there's a huge amount of coherence around the ideology of market liberalism and the idea that really the climate change proponents are part of a whole big sort of leftist, maybe even communist conspiracy. And then lastly, we found that there was a lot of satisfaction among contrarians and that they gained recognition from the action of sort of calling out or identifying what they see as corruption of science and that leftist conspiracy. So here are some quotes. These are from the interviews again at the 2011 Heartland conference. So Joe Bast is the president of the Heartland Institute, which is one of the most prominent libertarian think tanks that's engaged in climate contrarianism. Bast is currently the president and CEO, and he's also published a number of books and reports on climate science and why it's bunk. So he clearly feels that he's looking under the rug and exposing corruption. As you can see in the second quote, he says, liberals have no reason to question the science because it supports their entire political agenda. And he goes on to say that some of the policies proposed to combat climate change are really just a major expansion of the power and the size of government, and that, of course, this is a restriction on individual freedom. This should sound familiar. He also, interestingly, tells his own story of enlightenment. He used to be a member of the Sierra Club and Earth First, and then he tells the story of becoming enlightened by an economist friend, of course, and that he sort of like switched over from the dark side is how he tells it. Here's another example from a scientist. Pat Michaels is a climatologist, and until about 2007, he was a research professor at the University of Virginia and ended up at the Cato Institute as a director for the Center for Study of Science. He's also an author of a book called Meltdown, The Predictable Distortion of Global Warming by Scientists, Politicians, and the Media. And we can see here from his quotes that he believes publicly funded science has become corrupt and has become a vehicle for scientists to advance their careers. He says, global warming is a wonderful vehicle, and people need to be aware of that. They need to get rid of the notion that scientists are just passionate individuals who only seek the truth. They do seek the truth, they also seek their own advancement. Pat Michaels went on to say that the Cato Institute was the first place that he's ever worked where people actually like him. So again, we see that theme of perceived exclusion from the academy. Okay, so now I want to talk about the structure, the underlying structure of what Dunlap and McCreight call the denial machine, and also point to some of the strategies that are used. Okay, so here's the denial machine. This is adapted from Dunlap and McCreight. And what they found is a very well-organized, very well-connected, very well-funded, and very robust structure of denial here. And we see the base being the financial base, the fossil fuels industry, corporate America, which includes the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as well as industry trade organizations. We also see conservative foundations as providing money to think tanks and front groups, which then provide messaging to the media, to politicians, and which eventually reaches public opinion and policy. In terms of the resources that the denial machine has, a very recent study called Institutionalizing Delay studied the tax records of these think tanks and found that Robert Rule analyzed 91 organizations from 2003 to 2010 and found that the total amount of funding was $900 million, and that about on average these groups had about $64 million per organization to spend on producing data about climate change. He also found significant evidence that points to secrecy and the attempts to sort of hide where the funding comes from. And of course, the donors' trust was proven to be very influential, providing about 14% of the funding to counter-movement groups. And the donors' trust has been receiving a lot of press lately for that very reason. Okay, so moving on to some strategies. McCartney and Dunlap talk about 4 basic strategies used to produce data about climate change. I'll focus on the first 2, which are, intentionally obscuring and misrepresenting the science of climate change, and I would add the scientists as well. And then number 2, utilizing an existing bias in the media, and this was talked about a little bit in the keynote last night. And I would add and exploiting the capabilities of new media, such as the blogosphere. I want to also add a 5th strategy, which I call villainizing the convinced. 3 and 4 point to sort of using and invoking rules in the political system that are already there, and intimidating and threatening scientists directly. Okay, so first of all, obscuring and misrepresenting scientists and science. As I think you can all imagine, uncertainty and skepticism is inherent in climate science. It's an inherent part of the scientific process, but this has been extremely exploited by the climate denial machine. And additionally, the use of direct, what we call disinformation campaigns, such as the publication of books, which has been studied recently, and I actually brought along a copy which I'll pass around for fun. This is called The Mad, Mad World of Climatism, Mankind, and Climate Change Mania. I'm going to pass it around because it's so amazing. Yeah. Additionally, direct media outreach, we found that when we were interviewing those climate contrarians, about 40%, among some of them, 40% of their time was spent on media outreach, so providing messages to media. Additionally, there's been work done on looking at, thank you very much, syndicated columnists, and I'll move a little faster, I think I'm running short on time. Direct attacks to scientists and advocates themselves. When an inconvenient truth came out, there are attacks, for example, on Al Gore's weight, as a reason not to listen to him about climate science. Then lastly, the use of natural cycles rhetoric, the idea that global warming is attributable not to humans, but to just natural cycles of the Earth, has become very popular. Here's a recent result from Gallup showing that belief in the idea of natural cycles is rising, and sort of belief in anthropogenic climate change is falling. We can talk about that blip if you guys want to afterwards. Okay, so utilizing the existing bias in the media, I'm actually going to skip over this a little bit because it was addressed last night, and I believe it will probably be addressed again. We're not talking about ideological bias, we're talking about normative bias, journalistic norms of balance, and framing climate change as a debate, and the result on that in amplifying outlier views disproportionately. So here's something that I've been working on. This graph tracks counter-movement presence in major world news. There's 5 prominent climate contrarian groups here shown, and this basically looks at their name in a news article in conjunction with either global warming or climate change. And so this just tracks the number of times that happens in major world news since 2000, and we can see some interesting things arising. And again, I can go over this in more detail if anybody wants to hear about these blips more. Okay, so lastly, villainizing the convinced. This strategy is really threefold. First of all, framing climate scientists themselves as self-serving, greedy, and dishonest people who are just looking to advance their career and possibly just get more grant funding, basically. Secondly, contrarians frame convinced policymakers and the public as delusional, and in need of enlightenment by themselves. And third, contrarians frame the entire climate action movement as conspiring towards a power-hungry, leftist, liberal agenda. We can see an example here on the right, this book by James Dellenpole called Watermelons, The True Colors of the Environmental Movement. And of course, the inside of watermelons are red. Yeah, and hemorrhoids, of course. Yes, exactly. Okay, so thinking about the influence of climate contrarians, we can look to public opinion, firstly, and we see that since 2001, the number of climate skeptics has risen about has basically doubled since 2001. We can also point to the fact that we currently still have no national climate policy, we have no federal renewable energy standard, and we have not yet ratified the Kyoto Protocol. And also there's been some interesting analysis done on the rhetoric of the Obama administration, or the use of the words carbon pollution or climate change has significantly dropped, and focusing on clean energy and just energy security has risen, and sort of, to replace it. Okay, I also just wanted to quickly point to my current work. What I'm looking at now is what factors influence public opinion in rural areas where large-scale renewable energy facilities are built. I see a lot of the same rhetoric, especially the natural cycles rhetoric towards climate change, and this being used as a way to counter renewable energy installations. And additionally, the idea that it's all a leftist conspiracy is widely held, and I'm curious how that's filtered down from these contrarians and the denial machine. Okay, so in conclusion, I'd like to offer some points of observation. I'm really eager to hear everyone's thoughts on this. So I want to offer some similarities and differences between climate change denial and other forms of denial, like denial of genocide. Obviously, all forms of denial are motivated in large part by ideology. In terms of climate change, I would say the ideology is the idea of the free market, which obviously means reducing the government's control. Attacks on the merit of experts, of course, framing the convinced themselves as conspirators, and constructing the deniers as the heroes, the enlightened ones. And I think Emma Bloomfield will talk about this in her paper later on. So lastly, thinking about some differences, and I'd like us all to think about how important these differences are, and whether or not they're differences. The more I learn about genocide denial, the more I actually think some of them are similarities. So denial of the present and future in terms of climate change, and denial of the past. That's maybe a point of difference. Additionally, the role of uncertainty is being inherent in climate science, and indeed, climate change has been framed as a wicked or super wicked problem, and super wicked problems are basically characterized as those that are very uncertain, are very difficult to test, they evolve in very complex social settings, and some of the solutions may pose additional consequences we don't yet know about. Additionally, there's extreme polarization across political parties, and very well documented financial incentives for protecting carbon-based industries, and of course the role of the media in framing climate change as a debate. And then lastly, kind of considering the global scale of climate change, I wonder if that's also a point of difference that might be important to think about in our future discussions. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of our three speakers and look forward to discussion here. I'd like to offer a few remarks also. A few observations. First of all, on denial generally, we can see from all these papers that denial has a history. Denial has a social structure. Denial has a set of practices. It's observable, it's reproducible. It can be measured both qualitatively and quantitatively. In short, denial is an excellent subject for scholarly inquiry, but continuing certainly with this conference. Also, denial as a communication strategy is practiced at every level, from heads of state to op-ed writers to mothers in rural Rwanda. And denial is something that connects all of these levels. Denial as a communication strategy has a sender, it has a message, and it has a receiver. In each case, there's a third-party audience. And where political denial is concerned, a third-party audience seems to be required. That makes it different from if I do you wrong and I privately deny it to you. That's not the kind of denial we're talking about. It requires a third-party audience. And this is a key aspect of denial which also points to its function, and its communicative function, as reputation management. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Denial also is practiced by third parties whom we can think of as reputation bearers. For example, denialist scholars who provide legitimacy. The message has a political context, which is to say that denial is concerned with power relations. Maintaining reputation is important in power relations because it provides legitimacy without the risk or expense of using force. And the message not only manufactures a controversy, but it also turns the controversy into a cause. For example, dissipating the heavy cloud that blots the reputation of the Turkish nation, as Marc quoted. And oftentimes also we see that this means attacking the reputation of their opponents or the reputation of the victimized group. So let me say a little more about denialism as a tool of reputation management. Now, reputation management is an important theme in public relations and corporate communications today. Reputation is considered as an intangible asset for countries and corporations alike. It's related to such things as employee morale, demand for a country's or a corporation's products, the value of a company's stock. These are monetary incentives. It's important to successful diplomacy. Reputation also helps elites maintain political power through legitimacy because it is a component of legitimacy rather than violence. You can think of reputation in this sense as a form of social capital that can be built up, it can be invested, it can be squandered, it can be damaged, and therefore it must be managed. Reputation is especially important in a globalized market powered by the internet. Your stakeholders can find their information and products elsewhere. They have a lot of choices today. But at the same time, with so many choices, it's hard to distinguish sources of information, kinds of products. So many of them seem alike. There's so many choices available now. So even though there's that freedom, it's hard to make informed decisions, and therefore reputation becomes your competitive advantage, whatever it is that you're trying to put out there. Now, professional communicators today are taught to monitor threats to the client's reputation, and these can include self-inflicted threats such as unethical behavior. PR professionals are also taught to make ethical choices about the kinds of causes or clients they will or will not represent. It's worth noting that Marc mentioned Hill and Knowlton. The reputation of PR firms themselves, and Hill and Knowlton is a very good example, can rise and fall depending on the causes they take up. They themselves are subject to reputation management. Now, from Turkey's point of view, threats to reputation include international recognition of the Armenian genocide and other human rights abuses. So, in that context, denialism can be analyzed as a communication strategy to manage the country's reputation and build reputational capital. But old-style, heavy-handed denialism is no longer credible today, right? So we've now moved from heavy-handed denialism to manufacturing doubt, right? This is one possible response, because the old way is not so credible anymore. Case in point, Turkey's campaign to join the European Union. Now, there was a communications campaign at that time, which was managed by the Turkish Industry and Business Association, or TÜSİAD, in the Turkish acronym. The goal of that campaign was to increase trust and to build relationships. One of the challenges was to counter negative media coverage, including the issue of the Armenian genocide. So TÜSİAD concluded that they needed a European platform where each participant was free to express their opinion on sensitive issues. And so to that end, TÜSİAD laid the foundations for l'Institut du Bosphore in Paris and the European Integration Institute in Berlin. the aim was to promote the message of a modern and European Turkey to European intelligentsia and the general public. The head of that campaign, Doğan Yalçındag, also acknowledged that no single organization could possibly manage Turkey's reputation on its own. She said that the state, the private sector, and non-governmental organizations and academic circles have to work together. And this is a quote. She said, and here it is extremely important for successful country image management that the state assumes leadership, ensures the coordination of efforts that are underway, and makes available the resources required. That's a quote from her interview in a book called Reputation Capital, which I have the reference if anyone wants it. So, some conclusions and recommendations. First of all, that we study denialism as a complex of strategic communicative behaviors that are aimed at managing reputation capital, whether it's on an individual, a corporate, a social, or a national level. Second, the risks and rewards of denial are shifting, and they'll continue to shift. Old-style denial, heavy-handed denial, is no longer credible when it comes to the Armenian genocide. Actually, it damages Turkey's reputation. So the risk of it is now becoming more expensive. Okay? And so this is why, for example, TUSIAD felt the need to open up a platform for free expression on sensitive issues such as the genocide, because actually it introduces doubt on the denier's side of the equation too, interestingly enough. Also, a recommendation that we situate the study of denialism within the evolving professional standards of public relations and corporate communications as a field. How interesting would it be to bring PR practitioners into this discussion as critical observers of their own field, because there's plenty of that conversation within the field. And lastly, I'd like to suggest that studying denial as a functional strategy for the perpetrator is like studying the Armenian genocide as a strategy of demographic engineering. And that helps us to complete the picture. So with that, let me open this to questions.
Thank you all for your papers. It's really interesting stuff to initiate the discussion. But sort of even before I got here, I had a question about what exactly we mean by manufacturing denial, and certainly some of the processes have emerged. But also, what other sorts of denial might there be? And sort of thinking about the question when we emerged in the discussion was the triangulation between those who are speaking, and I think it emerged, to talk about denial in the singular as the denier may also obscure multiple groups. So you have the skeptics, for example, contrarians, so maybe, again, maybe different dynamics that are moving. In addition, the audience came up. Who's listening or who's not listening? So there may be an audience that gets the message, but there may be those who have some sort of stake, but it's completely missed. So you have the message, the doubt, the decoding, one of Stuart Hall's term from encoding and decoding. And along those lines also, what's been naturalized. So in other words, you have the message play into what's been naturalized. I think it came up in common sense as well in some of the discussions. So I don't know if you could, so there are a cluster of questions, and again, you can sort of pick and choose and address all of you, but just to sort of summarize again, when we talk about manufacturing denial, what other sorts of denial might there be, and what exactly do we mean by manufacturing denial? When we talk about the manufacturing, who, quote unquote, is doing the manufacturing, and might we potentially miss things if we sort of essentialize those, the quote unquote deniers? And then in terms of the messaging, who's receiving the message, what's at stake, what's been naturalized, and who's not listening, who doesn't care. So it seems to me that there are many levels that are sort of in play here as we talk about the topic of our conference, things that you could speak to, I'd appreciate.
I think that's an important point. So there's a book called Living in Denial by Kari Norgard, who's a sociologist, and she went to Norway to study climate change denial there, and it takes a very different form there, and I think the form of denial is really important, and who is doing that denial. And your question about what do we mean by manufactured or intentional denial is really important. But in Norway, it's a really different situation. The country, obviously, we can stereotype as being progressive and maybe environmental-minded. But there, what's happening is that climate change is it's acknowledged. It's people, the residents of the country believe that climate change is occurring, but they're only acknowledging it in the abstract, so it doesn't impact our everyday lives. Even though ski resorts are being shut down, that sort of thing is happening. And she uses Cohen's tautology of denial, which is, there's 3 types of denial. There's literal denial, which is just outright rejection, sort of the old school that Luann was talking about, which is becoming less common. But the other 2 forms are interpretive denial, such as the military's use of the word collateral damage to actually mean death. And I think that shows up in debates over the word genocide. What does it actually mean? Is it appropriate to use the word genocide? And then the last one is implicatory denial. So that's where you acknowledge that the facts are true, but the implications are sort of what's ignored or denied. And in the book I passed around, you can see that sort of denial. Well, there's both literal denial and implicatory denial, but basically the idea that, okay, fine, climate change is happening, but it's going to be really good for us, It's going to be awesome because it's going to be really warm, the ice caps, and we can, have farms up there and everything. So I do think it's really important to differentiate what we're talking about, and manufactured denial is, I think of it as contrarians who are actively engaged in trying to influence public opinion.
Yeah, I think when we talk about manufacturing denial or manufacturing controversy, we're by and large talking about the actions of elites who are in a position to disseminate this widely. And there's certainly a distinction between such deniers and, the rank and file, say, maybe non-existent average American man or woman in the street who is possibly ignorant or someone who is not aware of the facts about the Rwandan genocide or the Armenian genocide and denies out of ignorance or lack of access to correct information or the way they've been educated. And on the other hand, a denier who is in a position of some authority and position to present views in the full knowledge, actually, of their insupportability. I think that it's an important distinction to make, and I don't think they can be approached in quite the same way, of course.
And I was going to say that I don't deal with elites primarily. I mean, I do interviews with community and government stakeholders, but the 25 women that I was talking about are all Category 2 perpetrators, considered sort of mid-range. And they all are, an average age, average education level, average religion. They all represented the quote-unquote ordinary woman in Rwanda. And so they were the everyday woman. They were not in elite positions. And I think very much the idea of reputation management on an individual level is a component of why they revise or minimize or reject their participation in the genocide. Sometimes it's out of a space of shame, or it's also indicative of the ideology that they still hold, that they are the actual victims, and what happened was not, it was more of a travesty for them than it was for the actual victims of the genocide. And then there's also this lack of internalization of historical fact. And so they're I don't really know where to categorize them. They're these individual deniers, but as a whole, they show this recurring arc in their testimonies where they are minimizing or revising or in many ways rejecting the existence of a genocide. And so I'm having a hard time finding a space for them, a neat box in all of this, but it's helping me to realize maybe there isn't one.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel and the commentator. Conceptually rich discussion. I think there are a lot of concepts that will run across the other panels for us to discuss today. I have a specific question for Sara, and it picks up on some of the themes that were in the other two papers, and that is that gap between what people admit to doing and how they really feel. And that struck me as, on one hand, the Gacaca courts are seen as an indigenous solution, imperfect, nonetheless very successful. But from an American point of view, what you described is an elaborate form of plea bargaining.
Yes.
That's very much like the US system. If I admit to this, I get a lower sentence, and that has problems here, and I imagine it has problems there. And the specific problem I wanted to ask you about is, as a result of the plea bargaining, what are the implications not just for genocide documentation and education, but also future prevention? If my acts really didn't rise to the level of genocide, for example, what does that have, what tensions does that create with the ideological thought crimes of maintaining that sense that I'm the victim and not the perpetrator? As if you had to look forward 20, 25 years, how might this play out if you had to prognosticate?
If I was able to see into the future.
Of course, that's what we all try to do.
You know, one of the things that I find very interesting about the Gacaca courts is that there were 5, goals of the Gacaca courts, but the first one is a truthful rendering of what actually happened during the genocide. And I think that that's really important because it's not about punishment, it's about figuring out what actually happened, and then there are 4 other that they also include, holding people accountable and also finding justice for survivors. Look, I went into the Gacaca Court archives, which is this kind of football field length building that's just filled with boxes, 10 high and 25 long on either side. A lot of them are not digitized yet, so it's very difficult to find all 25 women that I interviewed, but I was able to get 9 of them. And in, I think it was 7 of them, it showed that women had falsified their testimonies or reduced what they had done. They had not represented themselves accurately when they spoke to me. But in the Gacaca documents, the way Gacaca worked was it wasn't just that you had an accuser and a defendant. You actually had the entire community come together, and any witnesses, accomplices, co-conspirators, others can come forward and also give their testimony. And so oftentimes somebody was not found guilty based on the testimony of one. In some instances that was the case, but it was the testimony of many. And so it's very hard to refute that and say, oh, but I didn't really do it, even if these 9 other people came forward and said they saw me do this, this, this, this, and this. So it's hard. Did I find the testimonies that I received from these women 20 years later to be the most accurate rendering? No, I relied more so on the Gacaca documents because they had also written out, they're all handwritten, but they also had written out the testimonies of witnesses, survivors, and also co-conspirators who said, in the instance of Gloria, there was a bystander who said, I saw Gloria come with this group and kill her auntie. And then there was also her family members who said Gloria came with us and helped us track her down in this garden space and kill her. And so then when Gloria says to me, I did nothing, I go back and I look at her documents and I see that in fact multiple people came forward and said that she did it. I'm more inclined to believe the documents. What does that mean 25 years down the road? I'm really not sure, because all the while the women were adamant about saying they didn't want another genocide. They had lost a lot during the genocide as well. Many of them saw the suffering, including the suffering of being incarcerated, to be an outcome of the genocide. They very much didn't want to go through it again. And so I'm not worried about them being the vanguards of the new recycling of violence. I'm more worried about the impact that they have on the next generation. Because Rwanda's trying so hard right now to bring up a generation that doesn't know violence firsthand. But what if they know bitterness and resentment and the recurring trends of, the Tutsi minority aggressor, the Tutsi elite who's always putting down the Hutu. Look at us, we all went to jail. Never mind the crimes we did that warranted being incarcerated. I'm worried about that more so than I am the very women that I interviewed, if that answers it.
Ms. Olson, I'm Richard Hoveness, and I wish, may I request in the morning, at least we identify ourselves so I know who you are. You don't care who I am, but I would like to know who you are. I'm looking ahead because there's a parallel with the Armenian case. Immediately after World War I, there was acknowledgement, etc. But with the survivor generation disappearing, the Rwanda survivors are going to disappear, and the rest will be their children, and they'll have stories. But what if in democratic elections, your Hutu majority will indeed gain power? A national, if you want to call it that, I don't know what a national is in Hutu terms are, takes over and begins then to rationalize and to relativize the Rwandan genocide in the way that it's being done in the Ottoman Empire. I see this real threat coming down the road, and you know, what do we do in front of it? The Holocaust survivors have interviewed 50,000 people and put them on film to have a living memory. And then to Ms. Matossian, my question is, you mentioned this woman who talked about coordination of efforts with the state. Well, it seems entirely logical, doesn't it? I don't see anything, I mean, I'm not sure why you said that, except to reaffirm the fact that all of these segments need to be brought together and given direction by the state. Right.
So Rwanda has elections coming up in 2017, and the current president has served his, it's a 2-term limit, and he will have served his 2 terms. And so there is a question of who will come in and take the lead in 2017. And there are 9 political parties in Rwanda. It's 9, right? 10 now. Okay, so there are 10 political parties in Rwanda. And so there is the possibility that the RPF, the Rwanda Patriotic Front, will lose the majority and another political party will come into power. One of the good things about Rwanda, I think, is that there's been a concerted effort to engage and educate the public in their civic responsibilities. And so I believe that there would be pushback from the public saying, whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa, we don't want to go down this road, but they've also criminalized genocide denial. And so there have been instances where political campaigners, politicians, started to go down that road that you're talking about, relativizing, minimizing the genocide, and they were immediately put in check or incarcerated for genocide denial. So I think that Rwanda, as not just the leadership, but as a country, is very concerned about recycling into that violence. You know, in 1994, it was a scorched earth policy, so it wasn't just about the destruction of people, but it was all material wealth. And so there wasn't a single public building in Kigali that wasn't in some way damaged. People remember that. They remember the devastation. They remember what it was like to not have crops and food and cattle and goats, etc., in order to just feed themselves. And so I think there is, on both sides, Hutu majority, Tutsi minority, I think that there is a general concern. But at the same time, you have a very engaged international community that has invested heavily in Rwanda and has a heavy presence in Rwanda. And I think that if it started to go down that road, there would be more of a check and balance on an international and an internal, intra level. And I also think that, I mean, I'm more interested in, I think that Rwanda may go the way of Germany versus Turkey in this. But it's going to take a while. You mentioned the 50,000 testimonies from Holocaust survivors. Rwanda has taken that to heart. They've taken those lessons. The Shoah Foundation is actually conducting interviews and recording testimonies in Rwanda. And also the Kigali Genocide Memorial has developed an archive. And that has over 300 recorded testimonies. And so they are slowly building up, and they've already, I mean, there's over 1,500 documents that are available on that archive, and they're slowly digitizing as well and uploading the Gacaca documents. And so I think one of the lessons that they learned about from the Holocaust is that we need to do this very quickly, because we don't want to be interviewing people in their 70s and 80s, 50 years after the genocide has taken place. They're interviewing people now.
Are records kept in the Gacaca courts?
Yeah, but they're
Yeah.
You walk in, and if you have allergies, they go to town. Because it's these mildewy boxes. They're supposed to be air conditioning, but I can tell you that the air conditioning only recently started working, and the air conditioning itself is a problem because that can also degrade documents. Everything's kept in these handwritten notebooks, and then they're all stacked up in these boxes, and the boxes are 10 high and 25 on either side, and on the outside it says, you know, the province, the district, the town. and you're just sitting there going, okay, if you're looking for a specific person, if you're looking for a certain woman, needle in a haystack. I was lucky to get 9.
Thank you.
Also, sorry, Sara, another question to you. Okay, Johanna Volhard, psychology. Here at
Can you
Clark.
speak?
Johanna
up?
Volhard from psychology.
Thank you. So you mentioned the individual denial on the individual level of perpetrators, which in a way is a common psychological problem, not just with genocide deniers, but with any kind of hate crime or harm that people commit. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the state level exclusion of the Hutu suffering or Hutu victims of the genocide. Right, the term is the genocide against the Tutsi, and the
Right.
commemorations. There's not really any mentioning of Hutu victims of the genocide, which of course is on a different scale with different motivations to some extent and so on. But when I think of the issue of acknowledgement and denial in the Rwandan context, this is an issue that always concerns me, in part also because of the backlash that can then occur, that I see in some of the interviews I have looked at in the Rwandan context with Hutus who say, well, what about the people my family lost in the genocide? We are not allowed to talk about that. So how would you describe that in these terms of denial, lack of acknowledgement?
So a few years ago, Rwanda officially titled the genocide against the Tutsi, which is considered accurate when you look at the definition of genocide as it stands, because many of the 50,000 or more Hutus who were targeted during the 1994 genocide were targeted as a result of their political standing. They were moderates, or they wouldn't go along with the genocide. And so they were seen as these victims of politically motivated killings or otherwise. And there is a sense of some exclusion from the title, Genocide Against the Tutsi, has become a very sensitive topic. At the same time, you know, in April during the 20th commemoration, I saw inclusion of this, of Hutu suffering at the same time alongside. And maybe that's, I haven't been present for, you know, the April 7th and that week of commemoration before this, but I saw that there was some inclusion there. And so, and also some inclusion of rescuers, so they started pulling positive messages as well. So I don't know if that's a shift, I don't know if that's an attempt to be more inclusive, but there was a conscious discussion on the ground amongst people who were survivors, but also people who were active in Kwibuka 20, which was the 20th commemoration. It was titled Kwibuka 20. There was an active discussion about being more inclusive. I'm not sure what that will look like in the next 10 years. I'm not sure what it looks like on the ground, you know, on the 21st, during the 21st commemoration. But I feel like there's a little bit of a shift. But yeah, there are some people who say, but what about my suffering? And there is, when it's commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi, and that opens up Rwanda to a lot of international criticism. But I felt like it was less so, and maybe I was talking to the wrong people, but it seemed less so when I was there this time. I don't know.
I'm thinking a little more, and I want to be a bit of a contrarian dictionary definition of that word to challenge part of the assumptions for this panel and your suggestion about raising denialism to a portion of academic study. Maybe we're being way too generous to people who are really purveyors of falsehood, and to think about putting them on a pedestal and having a, you know, canon in the academy to talk about that purveying of falsehood may not be the best strategy. I mean, that's one of the things that underlies denial, is that it's known conscious rejection of facts that have been confirmed, especially in the case of genocide denial, where it's not only historical, but it's legal confirmed fact that is beyond dispute. So, as a contrarian, I want to suggest that to us thinking about it. The other part that concerns me is that the denial is an attack on or re-victimization of the group that was targeted for extermination. But for purposes of prevention of genocide and recurrence, I think we should, as scholars, think about this more broadly. That is, not only is it re-entering those people who are targeted for extermination, but genocide denial is an attack on all of us. It's an attack on our humanity, and more importantly, it's an attack on our intelligence and our rationality to come in the scholarly form making claims that are known to be false to people who are engaged in not only inquiry into truth, but into interpretation of historical fact. And so we, as so-called knowledge makers, we ought to really question that, the road that we're going down. I mean, it's important to acknowledge denial, but we need to call it for what it is and to turn the clock around a bit and to attack these individuals based on their reputation as purveyors of known falsehood. And the thing that's damaging about it is that they're wrapped in reputation and academic elitism that then convinces others. And so I want to put that on the table for you, especially in the case of Rwanda, where we talk about why we should oppose genocide denial. Yes, it's re-injury to the victim, but if you think about it in the broader scope of never again, those who are on the outside, who aren't necessarily survivors and victims of it, what does it do to us as intelligent human creatures to listen to known falsehood and give credibility to it?
Let me begin by saying how much I appreciate your point. It's very well taken, and I think part of your concern may be that by studying denial as an academic pursuit, and studying as a pursuit, we may be actually contributing to the reputation of people, right? And so we're in a way playing into their game, right? But I guess I would respond by saying that when we study, for example, the Armenian genocide as revealed through Ottoman documents, right? We're not valorizing the perpetrator, but we are understanding the perpetrator's mindset and what the perpetrator was trying to accomplish functionally. I think that completes the picture of what genocide is, so that we can understand what it is and how it works, and then to combat it and prevent it.
Well, I took your suggestion to be
Yeah.
more of analysis of the mechanism of denial, which would now create the science around this falsehood.
Mm-hmm.
So not just to discover the true acts and facts of what happened in the perpetration, but looking at the system of denial instead as a scientific inquiry. That's the concern.
That's what I was advocating, is that we actually study denial as a communication strategy.
Well, then expose it for what it is and develop strategies to counteract it. Because sometimes we don't even know the underlying layers. I was just telling you about what looked like a seemingly respectable institute that's recently popped up on my radar. I started going through the documentation, and all they're trying to do is deny the genocide. I wrote to the director of this seemingly respectable Canadian institution, and I said, do you understand that some of the documentation that you're sharing on your website actually denies the Rwandan genocide? To which he wrote back, absolutely, that's the idea.
Really?
So we have to know and expose and understand the mechanisms that are the strategies, and also the complex kind of multifaceted attack on truth that's taking place, so that we can counteract it, expose it, see it as a threat.
I think what you're saying is very important, and it's one of the fundamental questions, at least in the topic that I was trying to deal with, which is how to address denial of the Armenian genocide, how to counter it, how to expose it without elevating it, without regarding it as, in any sense, a legitimate forum or form of scholarship or inquiry. And the conversation I've had several times with Deborah Dwork, who is not here today, but she's one of the organizers of this conference and the director of the Strausser Center. Her advice to me has always been, ignore it. And I say, I'd love to. You know, I know a lot of people who would love to. But unlike in the case of Holocaust denial, I think by and large, which is seen by, I think, the overwhelming majority of people rightly as a marginal, shadowy thing that has, it makes people cringe. Just denial of the Armenian genocide has attained, by one means or another that I've tried to describe, a level of academic seeming credibility that is very problematic. And to write about it in any way is to run the risk of saying that there's a scholar with whom I have a scholarly disagreement. It's very difficult not to do that. And I can think of a handful of instances that have really treated academic denial as a serious subject without falling into that trap. I can think of some of the works of Professor Mamigonian, some of the works of Professor Akçam, some of the works of some of the other people in this room, actually. But there's not that many because there's been a tendency to just want to not address it because of that fear.
I think it becomes tricky when it becomes sort of a argument of exposing the other side. There's a lot of work being done in academia trying to expose, the denial machine in terms of its mechanisms and its funding sources especially. But if we're working to expose them and they're working to sort of expose us, I don't know, I appreciate your point because I think it's a question of, is that an effective strategy? I think it's a very worthwhile pursuit to try to expose those connections and processes, but I just wanted to say I appreciate that, and it's a problem in study of denial-defying science as well.
I have a question for Shawn about, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about your lumping of citizen scientists in the contrarian category. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that that kind of space of citizen science opens up a way to collapse this idea that only the elites have the knowledge. And maybe, yes, some of them certainly are contrarians, but a lot of them are seeing all of this polarization and saying, well, maybe I'll find out for myself. And I'm not sure if that's the argument you're making, but.
Yeah, that's a good point. In my own experience, of course I'm biased because I'm looking specifically for contrarian stances. So I visit the blogs of well-established bloggers. The most prominent being the man who produces the blog What's Up With That. It's spelled WATPS, of course. And the level of anger on those sites it far outweighs anything I see on the pro-climate change side. And so I do think that actually, this is not empirical, this is my own observation, but it seems to be more fired up. And that it's being used more to deny than to expose the deniers.
Thank you. Shawn mentioned perception of exclusion and satisfaction from Conington's corruption among the motivational factors. But many, these are the elites that we're talking about, but many non-elites, non-elite conspiracy believers, they also feel excluded from socially, politically, economically, and denial or that gives them self-affirmation and skepticism. Maybe it's a reward mechanism. My question is if the elite is using this as a communicative strategy towards the non-elite, saying, exclusion, I feel you. That's it. That's one type of manufacturing. That's someone with monetary incentives, they're manufacturing now. But if this feeling is mutual, if the elite and non-elite feel the same way, that's a different type of product. That's not manufacturing by one, typical aggregator. That's a different product. That's maybe product of our culture or political system. So if it's the former type, there is one way to challenge that. You can challenge the perpetrator. But if it's the latter, I don't know how to address that issue, because if it's, then it's going to, any person, elite, non-elite, academic, whatsoever, who is dissatisfied, who feels excluded, is going to come up with something, and if it catches fire, then, oh, voila, there is a new issue of now. And how could we address that if it's the latter? I don't know. It wasn't it was a question and you turned to out loud thinking. Sorry about that. But.
Well, I think Leon addressed that last night. We were here for the keynote. He talks about sort of psychological process of denial and the fact that if you feel worse about yourself, you're probably more protective of your views. And I think that's a really important point to consider. I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's an important point though.
think it's possibly an error to make out denialism as something that is always in an other, from whom we must differentiate ourselves as a general matter. Denialism is just dead common, and we're, in my opinion, all denialists in some way. And we've all certainly been denialists about climate change in terms of our own political priorities and personal behavior for years, some of us more and some of us less. And the idea of otherizing denialists as a huge category seems to me to be a way to set up a fight ad infinitum. So it seems to me that it is important to find a way where we truly deeply connect. And I thought the comment that the climate contrarians are very angry is very important, because anger usually is a defense about something. And what is it that they are most deeply feeling? And one partial hypothesis would be a terror about what it means that this climate change is real. It's absolutely enormous, and I think the more one allows oneself to take it in, the more absolutely terrifying it is. And I think that the shame that the Germans still feel is enormous, even those, and particularly those, they're conscious of the shame of what their ancestors did, and that is with them all the time, and informs their work. And of course, the Germans have done more than anyone else to mitigate the crime than any other nation on the planet, and they were forced initially to do that, and one can't forget that. They were forced, but then they took it on, and that makes them unique. So I just think that's kind of what I want to say, that one has to find a way to deal with denialism by joining in some way with the others, which connects with the point made last night by the keynote speaker, that it has to be surrounded in some way or with humanizing the other and not dehumanizing them. I'll never forget, I'm a psychologist, and in my first placement at a mental hospital, there was a man who had committed, as far as everybody knew, incest with his young daughter. And he didn't know the label incest, I'm sure, just as many people don't know that they were committing genocide when they committed it. There wasn't a word. And he was quite clear that he was doing it to show his love for his daughter. So it's really important to get inside the mind in some very deep way of what society will call a perpetrator and must call a perpetrator of something terrible. But if healing and change is to occur, I think it has to come in connection with, in some deep ways, the emotions which are driving the positions. And that's my conviction, though, that emotions drive positions most deeply. So that may be deeply disagreed with.
I think you're certainly right that every human being engages in some form of denial in their lives.
Rwanda took a borrowed kind of a page out of the playbook following the Holocaust, where they also did re-education programs by way of Nganda. And the re-education really traced some of the roots of where this ethnic othering came from. And due to colonial rule, they were able to largely attribute blame for a lot of the exacerbated tensions on the German and then later Belgian colonial powers. And that, in a way, was they were able to, in a way, kind of assign the blame elsewhere and say, well, this ideology was not native to us. This came from another. And that was, in some way, a way to kind of make peace with participation in the genocide. And so often the women would say to me, well, it was because of the bad ideology or the poisonous ideology or the sickness that was brought by the Europeans, by the Belgians. And so that was an interesting thing to note, that one of the ways they made peace was to blame another.
Yeah, I also think that there's something to be said for recognizing the role of displaced anger. There was an excellent political book that came out a few years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? I don't know if any of you remember that, but it had to do with people being politically manipulated to vote against their own interests, their own economic interests, their own social interests, and they were manipulated to do so by political elites that displaced their anger at their own situation onto an other. Okay, their fear of their own situation onto another. And by the way, I mean, this has so much to do with how genocide gets committed in the first place. Why would it not have a role in denial? If we're serious about saying that denial is the last stage of genocide, then of course we're going to look for some similar motivations, and displaced anger is one of them. Anyway, next.
I was just wondering, the first speaker, I don't know, are you a doctor?
Am I a doctor?
Yeah. Because I don't want to say Marc, because I feel like that's disrespectful.
I'm not a doctor, no, but...
This is directed to you.
I thought perhaps you were ill, but...
You said that denialists of the Armenian genocide, one reason they say is the Armenians were not like wholly innocent and that they kind of deserved it. And I was just kind of wondering how, like, unless they were all openly in armed rebellion against the Ottomans, like every single Armenian, like what did they do to warrant such harsh punishment?
It's such a big question. It's a question that one would pose. I would want to pose to one of these scholars or in quotation marks or otherwise who would make such a statement. And you know, it almost always comes with the. But of course, this is not to justify the harsh treatment that was extended to ... It's almost like a formula. It's like a Homeric formula in reading denialist literature. You know the language that's coming because it's been repeated so many times. True that the Armenians were treasonous, a fifth column, in cahoots with the Russians, disloyal, etc., but it was still, what happened was still terrible and in excess of their actual guilt. I'm sorry, it's such a fundamental question that I'm not sure I know how to answer it.
Okay, let's just make the obvious point of clarification. I just want to ask the questioner. It's clear, I hope, that when Marc was talking about the idea of the Armenian victims not being innocent or any of the victim blaming things, is your concern that he was not quoting, but those were actually his views?
No.
Okay, good. Because he was quoting. All right, good.
I think that language matters a lot. And in one of the ways of getting at denialism is by controlling the use of language. Now, like, for example, in the words climate change, does anyone know where that comes from? That was from our dear friend Frank Luntz.
Yeah.
Right. And that was used to define in a neutral manner what people were previously calling global warming. So if you are concerned about that, you should be using the term global warming, not climate change. Likewise, I think that Paul Krugman of the New York Times has really done some very interesting writing in the area of the use of language when you're trying to define a counter-argument that's not being made from an intellectually honest perspective. And his use of words like the very serious people with capital VSPs to refer to the people who have been arguing for economic policies that are destructive to economic growth but serve a narrow elite. And I think that there's an important need for the use of language when it comes to genocide deniers also. I love the paper Marc gave a while back about the Tobacco Institute and the parallels between the Tobacco Institute and the Armenian genocide. And I think, frankly, there's a need to, when people are not arguing from an intellectually honest perspective, to frame the debate. Well, this is the Turkish version of the Tobacco Institute. We know what happened to the Tobacco Institute when the companies made the settlement with the government and went out of business. All those people were completely discredited. And I think that there's a place for that when you're talking to ideas, not as a way of necessarily talking about trying to slander a particular individual.
I totally agree, and I agree with you about Krugman as well. He's one of the few people, at least that I read regularly in quote-unquote mainstream press, who is very strong on these sorts of issues. And I think gradually the kinds of things we're talking about here in general are filtering more and more into the mainstream. And I haven't read Professor Nyan's piece yet, which is on the New York Times, but I will do so as soon as I have a computer in front of me.
It's also very important to frame that debate. I mean, I think that that's something that when the BBC came out and they basically kind of offered that their documentary was cutting edge and fresh and a new look, you have to say no. This is not cutting edge. It is not a new look. It's poorly researched and it's genocide denial. So reframe the debate. Don't argue it on their terms, but just call it what it is. It's revisionist history posing as some sort of I don't know, well-researched new view. It's just denial.
Just real quickly on that same point, in addition, I think being really careful not to, I mean, in regards to language, not providing more fodder for the contrarians or the deniers. And one really good example of that in climate change is this attribution of extreme weather events to climate change, which the first paper ever came out like a month ago that was able to link an extreme weather event to climate change quantitatively, and that was the heat waves in Australia. But, I mean, we've been seeing over and over again in the media and in our everyday lives, my mother, oh, it's so hot today, climate change, But being really, really careful not to do that, because that's a form of, that's providing some communication fodder for the other side to sort of poke holes in the climate advocates' arguments.
As I hear you, the four of you speak about these problems, and what I come away with is the large framework that we still don't have about how to deal with what is actually a crime. I mean, you're talking about criminal action. That's what we're talking about, we've been talking about. You can ignore it, as with the Armenian genocide. You can prosecute it for submission, as we saw with the Germans. You can plea bargain it away. Or you can, these are the four that I've come up with so far, produce something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Each one of those has its problems. And the problem is, what do you do with the perpetrator and what do you do with the victim? Obviously, the problem with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is you end up having no real punishment. So that was a book published a few years ago by Julian Slovo called Every Secret Thing. I don't know if anybody's read it. But what she does, her mother was murdered by she was a member of the ANC, and she was murdered by I think it was a pipe bomb. So she went to the perpetrator. She knew who the perpetrator was. The perpetrator was out walking the streets because, of course, that's the effect of this. And she went to try to have a real conversation, and it was a totally failed dialogue. He admitted, yeah, it happened, but it was on the passive tense, passive voice. He didn't really acknowledge his own role in it at all, which, of course, for her was the last thing in the world she wanted to hear. So she walked away from that, feeling like this was a complete failure for her. That's why she wrote the book. It was the only way she could get even with him, was to write this book and to get even, actually, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, too. Not that she argued against it. But I guess my question to the four of you, you thought yours was big. How do the rest of us, everybody else, those who are not involved, or even those who were, how do we define an appropriate response to something as huge as genocide that doesn't create the denial that you were talking about out of shame or guilt or an attempt to avoid repercussions, who knows? How do we do it in a way that acknowledges the victim and the victim's suffering without valorizing that? How do we do it in a way that doesn't create the kind of long-term suffering on the part of the descendants of those who perpetrated all of these violent acts? What kind of framework can we create that actually, for the next genocide, that's going to happen, that allows us to set a protocol so that we can walk in, we, what that we is, and actually do some good.
I'm going to stay up late tonight sitting and thinking about this. I think we have to keep, it's a process. We're learning from our practices, what worked, what didn't work, what failed in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, what failed in the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, what worked for the Gacaca courts, what didn't work for the Gacaca courts, the Sierra Leone case study. I feel like in every instance of and now they're developing it's not developing, it's actually happening, the criminal tribunals in Cambodia. So, you have to walk a very fine line because you want to respect and honor and in some way alleviate the suffering of the survivors. You want to also be able to memorialize those who were lost. You also want to be able to ensure that there is a peaceful way forward, which means incorporating and including in your rehabilitation and reconstruction processes, both of the people but of the state as well, you have to include the perpetrators. And so this inclusive approach it's extremely difficult. I've been watching Rwanda go through this for the last 10 years, and I feel like they're forever weaving a path and learning from the past, but also looking forward, seeing where they are in the present. And of course, and primary to all of this is stability and making sure that there isn't a recycling of the violence. So how do you manage all of that? It's a very tricky space to navigate. I'm not sleeping tonight.
I've been to that genocide denial with respect to Rwanda. This issue about external validation of denial is so important for what you just described, where Rwanda will move, because that's a society, unlike in Germany, that did not take the approach to have corporate shame for perpetration. And so, as you talk to females who were perpetrators, convicted perpetrators, admitted perpetrators, who are now trying to backtrack from it, there's a potential for an entire society to try to do that with the comfort, the aid and abetting of external persons who are not engaged in that controversy, to say, what you did was, understandable, debatable, it was bad governance and so forth. So that is my main concern after watching this for 17 years, because of Rwanda's decision not to stigmatize and have, kind of corporate criminalization of the perpetrator group. The comfort that people feel in that to re-perpetrate, especially if this issue of denial and the comfort they feel in denial from external actors takes off, then people have this rule. And we know that prevention and even ending of genocide comes from external forces, not internal forces. So this debate is more than just academic. It's what we do. And you asked a great question. What are the next steps? Well, the very next step has to be criminalization of genocide denial for everybody, not just for those who were perpetrators or inside the country where that killing took place. As I said before, we have intellectual and legal grounds to do it because of the attack on the outsiders, not just the survivors. And if we don't do that, and we present this as a balanced or academic inquiry, or maybe it happened and your point of view is just as good as mine, then it facilitates re-perpetration by those who are not contrite, who are not sorry, who are looking for a chance if they can to finish the job.
Mm-hmm. If I may say one quick thing, I know that the question wasn't about climate change, but I want to propose that implications of climate change are essentially mass murder of not only humans but also species. And so you're asking about what we can do in our everyday lives. I wanted to suggest that we sort of try to remind people about the fact that our entire society is based on the technology and science that we've derived in the scientific process, and making connections for people to that. I think Dr. Meehan referred to this last night. What I try to do is ask people, or tell people, we rely on scientists to tell us what medicine to take when we're sick, or making a number of other examples that are like very, very well accepted, and then saying, well, there's this 98% consensus right now among scientists, so why do you think there's such a debate? So asking people in that way and sort of renormalizing the whole basis of our society right now.
This is a great note to end with. It's now 10:30. I thank our panelists, I thank the audience, and you are all welcome to talk.